Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Today we're going to talk about a number of headlines directly and indirectly related to Bible prophecy, so let's dive right in. The first one I have for you today is from Zero Hedge. It says Russian nukes can be used to defend annexed Ukraine regions, Kremlin warns. Once again, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, has served the role of issuing more severe, quote, read between the lines warnings and threats fresh off Vladimir Putin's Wednesday speech announcing partial mobilization of national forces and which confirmed referendums of occupied portions of Ukraine to join the Russian Federation. Putin's most alarming line came when he said, "If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people," following with, "It's not a bluff." He had also stressed Moscow is ready to use all available means to protect its territorial integrity. Medvedev has taken the president's words further in Thursday's statements, stressing that regarding Russian seized territory and the move to vote in several areas, there is no going back, and even a nuclear option could be on the table. So we're seeing threats from Russia to go nuclear over the war in Ukraine. It goes on, it says the Donbas republics and other territories will be accepted into Russia, he posted to Telegram. That's when the former president and top national security official doubled down on Putin's nuclear warning, stating, "Russia has announced that not only mobilization capabilities, but also any Russian weapons, including strategic nuclear weapons and weapons based on new principles, could be used for such protection." Putin and Medvedev's statements mark the first time any top Russian officials have affirmed readiness to bring newly acquired Russian territories under Moscow's nuclear doctrine. However, it remains that Russian forces do not yet control 100% of any of the four main territories where annexation votes are to be held, with some referendums set for early this weekend according to prior reports. A review of the past 48 hours of Kremlin decision-making, which is poised to escalate this war even further, here is the logical course of what just got enacted in the call-up of some 300,000 reservists. Conscripts were previously told they won't be sent to Ukraine to fight because they are stationed to defend inside Russia. Ukrainian-held territories are now about to vote to join the Russian Federation. When these territories join the Russian Federation, they are then considered, quote, inside Russia. And then any attempts to defend them would be marked as an invasion of Russian territory if supported by NATO equipment. Thus, Medvedev's warning of a willingness to use nukes covers these territories in Ukraine. So right now, Russia controls large parts of southeastern and southern Ukraine. They're going to hold referendums in these areas to vote on whether or not to join the Russian Federation. I would assume that those votes will turn out the way Russia wants them to, and then they will declare that that is Russian territory, and any effort by NATO to attack those territories, to defend those territories, which they are already fighting in right now, would be considered an act of war, and they're saying they may very well respond using nuclear weapons. So this is a very serious situation. This is going to be something we'll be watching over the weekend to see exactly what happens. You know, as this tweet says, coming from the person who has the sole decision-making power regarding Russian nuclear weapons, this will have to be taken seriously. Territorial integrity is, of course, tricky, as Russia is currently planning to absorb 4 Ukrainian regions, none of which is even fully controlled by its armed forces. Would this mean that Ukraine would be threatened with nuclear weapons to hand them to Russia? Putin's emphasis of this is not that this is not a bluff notwithstanding. Some analysts say this is all about posturing in order to scare NATO away from escalation. I think it signals that he wants people to think he would risk nuclear war, Phillips O'Brien, a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, said. I don't think it means he is any more likely to do it than he was yesterday. If he says that any attack on soil that he calls Russia is going to be a nuclear tripwire, Ukraine's already broken that in Crimea, O'Brien added in comments given to NBC. Yet Washington says it is taking this nuclear rhetoric seriously. As for the White House, President Biden in his Wednesday UN General Assembly speech in New York called out Putin's overt, reckless, and irresponsible nuclear threats, warning that such wars should never be fought and that Russia's actions should make everyone's blood run cold. He renewed his warning of a nuclear war cannot be won, saying the U.S. does not seek a Cold War. Now, I think it's good that Washington is taking this nuclear rhetoric seriously. President Biden called Putin's threats overt, reckless, and irresponsible, which I agree with. But I would also include the words of Phillips O'Brien, this professor of strategic studies, the University of St. Andrews. I think his comments are also overt, reckless, and irresponsible. And I hope that there's not a lot of advisors like him on either side of this conflict right now, because this is this type of thinking that says, I think it signals he wants people to think something, and it's a bluff. I don't think he's any more likely to do this than he was yesterday. That type of thinking is what leads to the escalation of these potential nuclear conflicts. These types of conflicts have been exercised and war-gamed out for decades. And this is exactly how we would see a nuclear war arrive, as people making miscalculations and underestimating and being misinformed of the actual intentions of their adversary. And so they're constantly ratcheting up. Maybe it is a bluff. I don't know. Or maybe Putin is trying to emphasize over and over again, I'm not bluffing, don't push me. And so what is that? Are we willing to risk a global nuclear war over this conflict? And remember, this is, again, we've talked about how wars in history are often fought because each side thinks that they can easily win. They make miscalculations. They underestimate their opponent. One thing leads to another. They think they can control the situation, and then it spirals out of control. And so I hope we're not in one of those situations right now, but this is one that we really need to keep an eye on, because this is probably the closest we've come to nuclear war since the Cold War, and all the different, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the different accidents that we learned about after the Cold War, near accidents that almost took place and led to a Cold War. So we want to keep an eye on that. That leads into this next story. It says, German bakery handed 330,000 euro bill for gas consumption. A previously concluded contract with a price guarantee until the end of 2023 was allegedly suddenly terminated. It says the energy company E.ON has demanded a significantly higher gas bill from the Hanoverian bakery owned by Eckhard Vader, sending his company a bill of 330,000 euros for gas consumption over the past 4 months. In addition, the man has to pay the amount within 14 days. Are they crazy? Vader reacted indignantly. According to the Bild newspaper, a year ago we paid 5,856 euros per month in gas costs for our large furnaces and heating. The chief of the family business had formally concluded a contract with a price guarantee until the end of 2023. However, it was allegedly suddenly terminated. Now his new energy supplier is demanding a price increase of 1,200%. Vader has not received a reason for the price increase. Well, we know what that reason is. It says, since his large bakery is a craft business under commercial law, he could not receive any support from the state. He claims to have paid around 19.9 million euros in taxes in recent years. That's why he recently took part in a demonstration in Hanover with approximately 1,000 colleagues under the motto, soon the oven will be turned off. So here we have a family-owned business. It's been around since the 1950s. they're getting hit with a 12 to 14-fold increase in the energy cost. There's no way they're going to be able to remain open under that scenario. They can receive support from the state. Again, we've been over, the state can print euros. They can print currency all day long and hand it out to bail out large and small businesses, households. They can do all that they want, but that does not solve the problem. The problem is a lack of energy, and printing currency does not create more energy. And so this problem is going to persist. And if we see that Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons right now over the war in Ukraine, do we really think that they're going to say, oh, look at the hassle that's being caused in the European Union over us cutting off natural gas, turning off the pipelines. Maybe we should do something about that to ease their pain. No, Russia's made it very clear that until the sanctions are dropped, until they're lifted, until NATO backs off, this is part of their financial war that they're pushing. And ultimately, I think that that's all this is about, is destroying the West financially. We've been over that in the past. But again, expect these significantly higher energy prices in the European Union to persist. And I believe this is going to cause a depression in Europe, and it's going to cause a global depression as that contagion spreads around the earth, because something is going to break. Governments can't bail out of this because they can't simply flip a switch or sign a piece of legislation that creates more energy. And people need energy to live. Economies need energy. It's the fuel that they thrive on. It's the backbone of economic activity. Without it, everything shuts down. As this article said, soon the oven will be turned off. A lot of things are being turned off in Europe right now. And we're going to have a very dark winter in Europe and globally, from a financial perspective, from an energy perspective, all around the world. And speaking of that, on energy, this is from oilprice.com. It says, how big a problem is America's shrinking oil reserve? It says, what is the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve? What are the implications of depleting it, which the U.S. has now been doing since 2016? Further, what has been the impact of the rapid drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that's taken place this year? Let's discuss. It says, in December 1975, with memories of gas lines fresh in the minds of Americans as a result of the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, Congress established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The law was designed to reduce the impact of severe energy supply interruptions, such as that caused by the embargo. Over time, the U.S. government began to fill the reserve. At its high point in 2010, the level reached 726.6 million barrels. Since December 1984, the level has never been lower than 450 million barrels until now. Some have noted the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is less important than it once was. U.S. shale oil production has enhanced American energy security and lessened the importance of the SPR by reducing our dependence on imports. Consider that in 2005, the U.S. imported 10.1 million barrels per day of crude oil, of which 4.8 million barrels per day, around 48%, came from OPEC. The SPR contained 685 million barrels. With the U.S. importing 10.1 million barrels per day of crude oil at that time, it was enough oil to cover 68 days of supply. In 2021, the U.S. imported 6.1 million barrels per day, of which only 800,000 came from OPEC. More importantly, a lot of that imported oil was refined and re-exported as finished products. Net imports of U.S. crude oil and finished products were actually negative 62,000 barrels per day, as the U.S. was a net exporter. Thus, one could certainly argue that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is of less strategic importance than it once was, and that perhaps we no longer need a 700 million barrel reserve of oil. So before, I think it said they were a 68-day supply. Yeah. Back in 2005, where we sit right now is around 100 days of supply. But back in March, due to the high gas prices and the political outcry, the Biden administration decided that over a 180-day period, which is set to end at the end of this month, they would release 1 million barrels of oil per day. And it's definitely had an impact on the global oil market and the price of oil, lower gasoline prices, but that can't go on forever. And while this article argues that, okay, it's not that big of a deal because of shale oil and the United States isn't importing as much, at the end of the day, we have a global oil market. And this release at the 1 million barrels per day, while that doesn't seem like a lot, on the global marketplace, that's enough to shift prices significantly. So when that stops happening, we would expect, and especially if it stops happening and then they go into a point where they're accumulating and trying to refill that strategic petroleum reserve, then we're going to see prices, global prices, go up even higher, making the energy crisis even worse. And again, there's several problems that I have with this article. One is that shale oil, while it's been a blessing to the United States, it's not going to continue forever. A lot of these wells, they're running dry. They're having to pour a lot more capital in to bring that oil up. They've hit all the easy spots. So this isn't something that's going to persist for a century. We're looking at, by the end of the decade, they could run out of these resources if we don't make new investments. And it's just, we need a strategic petroleum reserve. What happens if there's another embargo or a war? We're looking at potential hotspots all around the world. We got the war in Ukraine right now. But I think that this is going to eventually lead to the prices going back up as an end is put to this effort to release 1 million barrels of oil per day. And so we have an ongoing energy crisis with a global food crisis, as we've talked about. So this is from Zero Hedge. It says a global food supply crisis may worsen due to a poor U.S. harvest. U.S. agriculture has been facing a poor harvest this year, aggravating the global food supply crisis, industry executives have said. The supply of food worldwide has been tight since Russia's war in Ukraine cut off vital shipments of resources needed to make fertilizer and grain products from the region. Several high-level executives from big agricultural firms such as Bayer, Corteva, Archer Daniels Midland, and Bunge told the Wall Street Journal that it will take at least 2 more years of good harvest in North and South America to ease the supply pressures. The current market expectation is that global grain and oilseeds markets need 2 consecutive normal crop years to stabilize global supplies, said Chuck Magro, chief executive at Corteva, at an investor presentation. This year's grain harvest has fallen below normal yields in the West, hindering efforts to restock global crop supplies. The United States and South America, 2 of the world's major crop exporters, faced persistent drought conditions this summer. The hot summer worsened drought conditions in states throughout the U.S. grain belt, which saw a major reduction in the harvest due to lack of water and a wet spring planting season earlier in the year. The U.S. Agriculture Department announced on September 12th that it had lowered its nationwide corn production estimates to 13.9 billion bushels. And over a month ago, we went back and we looked at their August 12th report at the time and said, this doesn't match the reports we see coming from the ground. And we went over that and said their estimates were high, they're going to continue lower. I think when we look at October 12th and that report comes out, we'll see them go down even lower. And that's just in the U.S. where they have much more access to much more data than they have in other countries, especially in Africa, where you have tens of thousands of small farms producing the majority of the food that they consume. So I don't have access to that data yet, but it's going to become apparent when the harvest time comes. So this says this is 3% lower than USDA's projections in August, about 8% lower than the total amount harvested last year. Projections for soybean production estimates in September were down 3% from August, down slightly from 2021. So again, this is an issue that we really need to keep an eye on, because we've discussed before that as we head into the end of this year and into 2023, we're really going to see food shortages. Depending on where you are, it's, there's going to be famine and starvation in some places around the world, but everywhere is going to see a continuation of food inflation, unfortunately. So if you have the chance, you need to set aside some food while you still can. This article goes on. It says, Global Food Crisis. The United Nations Global Food Security Summit on Rising Food Insecurity on September 20th warned of a devastating crisis next year if the war continues. Representatives from the United States joined officials from the European Union and the African Union to discuss the effect of the conflict in Ukraine on food prices. As we've seen over the last years as a result of COVID, before that climate change and more recently conflict, notably Russia's aggression against Ukraine, profound food insecurity touches well over 200 million people on this planet, including, of course, in Yemen, said U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who urged a renewal of the Black Sea Agreement. The executive director of the UN World Food Program, David Beasley, told the United Nations Security Council last week that the world is now facing a global emergency of unprecedented magnitude, with a real risk of multiple famines this year. He said that 345 million people are facing starvation, with 70 million directly affected by food shipments disrupted by the war in Ukraine. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said that while enough food is being produced worldwide, the main problem was distribution. This summer, UNICEF and the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization said that between 702 and 828 million people were impacted by hunger last year due to disruptions caused by the pandemic. Guterres stated that if the current situation in Ukraine does not stabilize in 2022, we risk to have a real lack of food by 2023. Again, we've talked about this numerous times before, guys, and I think regardless of what happens in Ukraine, this is going to be an issue going forward for, unfortunately, several years into the future. Why is that? Well, we saw beginning last year this time, with the rising prices of energy, we saw fertilizer production curtailed, especially in Europe, led to higher prices for fertilizer, which meant that some farmers applied less. That means they're going to get less yield. We saw higher diesel prices having a huge impact at one point. We've seen the drought, but right now, with the energy prices skyrocketing in Europe, which accounts for a third of the world's fertilizer production, we're seeing fertilizer production facilities shut down. I think at this point, around 50% is completely shut down, and we're likely to see that number rise. Factories in other parts of the world don't have the ability to just take on that capacity and replace it. So we're going to see real shortages of fertilizer well into next year and probably 2024. So this is going to be a persistent crisis. So, the Bible says to prepare for such things. So if you have the ability, put a few extra cans of food away for later this year and into 2023. Look out for your friends and neighbors, your community, your local food bank could use your support. But be prepared for this, because we're seeing this come. Now, what does this have to do with Bible prophecy? Well, Jesus said that famines, generalized famines, would mark the timing of his return. It's not the only indicator, but it's one sign of many that are converging, along with all the rest, to tell us that we now live in the season of the Lord's return. So we're seeing all these issues. We're seeing wars and rumors of wars, pestilence, famine, earthquakes. These were all things that Jesus talked about when his disciples said, "What are the signs of your coming and the establishment of your kingdom?" And he told them to look for those things, and he said they would exponentially increase like birth pains. And we're definitely seeing that. We're seeing them increase in frequency and magnitude, and we may be looking at potentially the largest and worst famine in human history coming up here in 2023 and into 2024. So just pray. Again, our hope is in Jesus, not in the things of this world. So don't let news like this bring you down. We should have joy. We should be happy that we have today and that God has provided for us today, and we should use that as an opportunity to preach the good news to as many people as possible, and to feed people if we're able to do that, and to take care of our fellow man, and just be a light to the world. So, guys, thanks for being with us today. I know this ran a little bit long, but God willing, I'll see you on Monday. Make sure to like and share this, and I'll talk to you then. All right. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.